She asked me to stay after class, and the way she smiled made me forget everything else. The classroom hummed with the faint remnants of the day's lessons, the sound of chairs scraping softly against the linoleum floor gradually fading as the last students trickled out. I lingered near my desk, pretending to sort through my notes, but my attention kept drifting toward her. She moved with a quiet grace, gathering papers and arranging them with deliberate care, her presence somehow commanding the room without needing to raise her voice. There was a warmth to her movements, a subtle elegance that made everything else in the classroom feel dimmer by comparison. Her heels clicked lightly on the floor, the sound sharp yet comforting, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I wasn't entirely ready to hear. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the blinds, catching on the dust motes suspended in the air, and for a moment, she was framed in that golden light, her hair catching the glow, the edges of her blouse illuminated in a soft halo. It was a scene so ordinary, and yet, the ordinary had suddenly become extraordinary. She glanced up, and our eyes met for the briefest instant. That fleeting contact sent a jolt through me I didn't quite understand. There was no overt intention in her gaze, no signaling, no flirtation, but it held something unspoken, a quiet curiosity that mirrored my own. My pulse quickened, though I reminded myself to act casual, to focus on my notes, and not the way her eyes seemed to linger just a second too long. I watched her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the motion almost unconscious, and I felt myself noting every detail, the soft curve of her smile, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she leaned over her desk. There was a serenity about her, a calmness that made the chaos of the school day feel distant and unimportant. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for some small signal, some acknowledgement, though I wasn't entirely sure what I hoped it would be. The smell of her perfume reached me in subtle waves, something floral and warm, almost like vanilla mixed with sunlight. It was intoxicating in its quiet way, grounding me in the moment, making the classroom feel intimate even though it was empty and spacious. And then she looked at me again, this time with a faint smile, small, almost shy, but undeniably there. It wasn't a smile that demanded anything from me, yet it made me aware of her presence in a new way, as though she had just subtly drawn me closer into her world. I turned back to my notes, pretending to concentrate, but the memory of that smile lingered, delicate and persistent. Something had shifted in the quiet rhythm of the classroom. I didn't know what it was yet, and perhaps I wasn't ready to, but I knew the day I first saw her like this would linger in my memory far longer than any lesson on the board. The ordinary had become extraordinary, and I could feel the pull of something unspoken, something gentle yet insistent, waiting to be discovered. The next class felt different, though nothing had visibly changed. The room smelled faintly of chalk and old books, a comforting combination that always made me feel slightly more grounded. I found my usual seat near the window, pretending to focus on the scattered papers in front of me, but I couldn't stop noticing her, the way she moved around the classroom, the effortless confidence in each step, the soft smile she reserved for everyone, yet somehow it felt as though a fraction of it was meant just for me. During a group exercise, I ended up needing help with a particularly tricky problem. She leaned over, her blouse brushing my shoulder for the briefest instant, just as she guided my hand to the correct line in my textbook. The touch was fleeting, accidental even, but electric. I felt a warmth travel up my arm, a quiet reminder that even small gestures could carry a weight I wasn't prepared for. Her presence felt grounding, yet somehow thrilling, like standing on the edge of a calm sea that hides currents beneath the surface. Her voice, calm and warm, broke through my thoughts. She explained things slowly, deliberately, with that subtle laughter tucked into the edges of her tone, just enough to make the lesson feel personal, intimate, though completely appropriate. I found myself leaning in, drawn not only to the clarity of her instruction but to the way she made me feel noticed, valued, and safe, all at once. Every glance she cast my way felt carefully measured, as if she were acknowledging my presence while also testing the boundaries of propriety. I noticed little things I hadn't before, the way she would tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear while speaking, the slight tilt of her head as she listened, the quiet rhythm of her breathing when she paused. Each detail seemed amplified, heightened by my growing awareness of her subtle attentions. It wasn't romance in the overt sense. There were no suggestive gestures or words, but it was undeniably intimate, a quiet acknowledgement that we both understood something unspoken. When she handed me a pen I had dropped, our fingers brushed ever so slightly. The contact was brief, yet it lingered in my mind long after the moment passed. Her eyes met mine, and for a heartbeat, I felt something unnameable, a mixture of curiosity, care, and gentle amusement, before she returned to helping the rest of the class. I could tell she was aware of me in a way that went beyond student and teacher, though everything remained perfectly appropriate. By the end of the session, I realized I had been paying more attention to her than to my notes. Every glance, every small touch, every fleeting smile seemed to carry a quiet weight I couldn't quite quantify. She had a way of noticing the smallest things about me, the way I hesitated over a problem, the way my hand shook slightly when I was nervous, and responding with a subtle, unspoken encouragement. As the classroom emptied and the chatter of other students faded, I was left with an undeniable awareness of her presence lingering in the air. Something had shifted again, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The connection was growing, quiet but insistent, a tension wrapped in the most ordinary classroom interactions. And I realized, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, that I was waiting for the next moment, the next small gesture, when our worlds might brush together again. The classroom was quieter than usual that afternoon, the usual buzz of students and papers replaced by a calm hush that felt almost intimate. Most of the others had already packed their bags and filed out, their footsteps echoing softly down the hallway. I lingered near my desk, pretending to review my notes, but my attention kept drifting toward her. She moved with that same quiet grace, stacking papers and straightening the corners of textbooks with a kind of meticulous care that seemed natural, effortless, and strangely mesmerizing. "Would you mind staying for a few minutes?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft, calm, yet carrying a subtle warmth I hadn't noticed before. My chest tightened at the words. The request was casual, professional on the surface, yet something in the way she looked at me, her eyes holding a hint of encouragement, a quiet expectation, made it feel different, personal. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral, though my heartbeat betrayed me. One by one, the last of the students left, their chatter fading until it was just the two of us in the classroom. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of anticipation, a subtle tension that made the air feel thicker, more intimate. She gestured for me to take a seat across from her desk, and I obeyed, acutely aware of the space between us, yet feeling somehow drawn into it. As we discussed my project, I found myself noticing details I hadn't before, the way the sunlight slanted across her face, catching the faint highlights in her hair, the gentle curve of her lips when she smiled at a thought or comment I made. When she leaned over my notebook to point something out, the soft brush of her hand against mine was almost accidental, yet it sent a warmth through me that lingered long after her touch. My mind became a mix of focus and distraction, trying to absorb her instructions while secretly cataloging every small movement, every subtle signal. She spoke with that calm, deliberate patience she always had, but now there was a gentleness in her tone that seemed reserved for me alone. Every so often, her eyes met mine, and in that brief contact, I felt a quiet connection, a sense that she was aware of the effect she had without needing to say anything. The moment stretched in time, neither rushed nor forced, just a shared space where attention and awareness were tangible. Even the ordinary sounds, the ticking of the clock, the soft shuffle of papers, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, seemed amplified in this quiet classroom. The subtle scent of her perfume mixed with the faint aroma of books, creating an atmosphere that was both familiar and charged with something I couldn't yet name. When our discussion finally wrapped up, she gave me a small, knowing smile, the kind that felt like an invitation without words. It wasn't forward, it wasn't suggestive, but it lingered in my mind as I gathered my things, a spark of something unspoken hanging in the air. As I stepped toward the door, I realized that this simple act, staying behind, sharing a quiet moment, had changed the way I saw her, and perhaps, the way she saw me. The ordinary classroom had transformed into a space of subtle intimacy, and I left with a heightened awareness that this was only the beginning. The classroom felt almost suspended in time, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the desks in soft, golden streaks. Outside, the world had gone on without us, but inside, the air seemed charged with quiet significance. I sat across from her at her desk, the open notebook between us forgotten for a few moments as our conversation drifted beyond formulas and facts. "I've noticed you've been thoughtful lately," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying a subtle warmth that made me feel both seen and unguarded. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching, yet gentle enough to invite honesty. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, yet the quiet encouragement in her gaze gave me courage. Slowly, words began to spill, small admissions about the pressures I'd been feeling, doubts I hadn't voiced to anyone else. She listened with patience, leaning slightly forward, her hands resting near mine on the edge of the desk, close enough to feel her quiet presence without crossing any boundary. Her attention wasn't intrusive, it was grounding. Every nod, every soft murmur of understanding made me feel like my thoughts had weight, like they mattered. When she smiled at a particular point, it wasn't a casual gesture. It was warm, acknowledging, the kind of smile that makes a person feel lighter, as though their worries have been noticed and softly held. I noticed the subtle details I had missed before, the way the light played across her hair, catching faint golden highlights, the rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders as she listened, the gentle, almost imperceptible tilt of her head that conveyed curiosity and empathy. Each movement was understated, but in this quiet space, they became profound. At one point, my hand brushed the edge of hers as I reached for my pen. It was accidental, fleeting, yet it carried a warmth that lingered long after. I became aware of how close we were, yet not in a way that felt inappropriate, just intensely human. The distance between us was measured, but it was filled with subtle connection, shared breaths, quiet laughter at a minor joke, the comfortable silence that settled when words weren't necessary. Her voice guided the conversation gently, weaving between encouragement, insight, and curiosity. She asked questions that drew me out, not just about my project but about what I wanted, what I feared, what I hoped for. And I found myself answering honestly, perhaps more honestly than I had to anyone in a long time. There was a softness in her responses, a careful balance of understanding and gentle challenge, that made me feel both seen and encouraged to grow. By the time we finished, I was aware of a shift, a subtle but undeniable sense that something unspoken had deepened between us. Not desire in the overt sense, but a quiet, profound awareness of connection. I left the desk feeling lighter, yet my mind lingered on the warmth of her smile, the steadiness of her presence, and the way a simple conversation could feel so profoundly intimate. The ordinary act of talking had transformed into something extraordinary, a shared space of trust and attention, and I knew the next meeting, the next moment alone with her, would carry even more weight. The room was quieter than it had ever felt, the fading afternoon sunlight casting long, golden stripes across the floor. Papers were stacked neatly, chairs tucked in, and the soft hum of the air conditioning was the only background sound. It was just the two of us now, the rest of the world paused outside the classroom doors. The space felt suspended, intimate, and somehow heavier with unspoken possibilities. She offered me a cup of tea, a simple gesture, but one that carried weight. When her fingers brushed mine as she handed it over, it was almost accidental, but the warmth lingered in my hand, in my chest. I felt acutely aware of her presence, the subtle curve of her smile, the light that caught in her eyes, making them seem softer, more open. I held the cup longer than necessary, pretending to focus on its warmth while noticing the smallest details about her, the gentle arch of her eyebrows, the way she leaned slightly forward, waiting for a response, yet content to remain silent. We sat across from each other, the notebook between us mostly forgotten. Words had been said in previous meetings, but now silence held the room. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, a quiet anticipation that made each small movement feel amplified. The faint sound of her breathing, the subtle shift of her posture, even the scratch of her pen on paper moments before we stopped speaking, all of it seemed magnified in the hush. Every glance felt meaningful. When our eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding that didn't need to be voiced. Her gaze was steady, gentle, inviting me to notice, to feel, to linger. I caught myself leaning slightly closer without realizing it, drawn to the calm warmth of her presence, and I could sense her doing the same, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the tension between us hummed like an unspoken chord. The sunlight shifted, brushing across her cheek and neck, highlighting the softness of her skin, the subtle warmth of her features. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, floral and comforting, that seemed to blend perfectly with the quiet intimacy of the room. Every small gesture, the brush of her hand as she moved her cup, the tilt of her head as she observed my expression, the gentle exhale as she leaned back, felt loaded with meaning, though none of it crossed any boundary. I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and calm, the sort of tension that exists when two people are perfectly aware of each other's presence but are letting the moment breathe. No words were necessary. The room itself seemed to speak in sighs and glances, in the brush of fingertips and the steady rhythm of quiet attention. Eventually, the moment passed, but the memory lingered. The room returned to ordinary lighting, ordinary sounds, and ordinary spacing, but I left acutely aware that something had shifted. That silence had spoken volumes, had drawn us closer in ways words never could, and had laid the foundation for something slow, deliberate, and profoundly intimate. The classroom was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon light, the long shadows stretching across the floor as the day edged toward evening. Outside, the distant hum of the hallway had faded completely, leaving only the quiet presence of the two of us in the space. There was a weight to the silence, not uncomfortable but charged, as though the room itself had taken a breath and was waiting with us. I had been hesitant to speak, unsure of how much of myself I could reveal, but something about the calmness in her eyes, the steady warmth in her voice, gave me courage. I found myself opening up about a recent disappointment, something I had tucked away, something I rarely admitted even to friends. The words felt fragile as they left my lips, yet in the quiet space between us, they were met not with judgment but with understanding. She listened intently, her gaze never leaving mine, her posture relaxed yet attentive. When she leaned closer, just enough to offer a comforting presence without crowding me, I became aware of the subtle warmth radiating from her, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the quiet of the room. I felt grounded and exposed all at once, as though every vulnerability I had confessed had been gently cradled by her attention. "You've been carrying this alone for too long," she said softly, her voice measured and soothing. Her hand moved toward my shoulder in a gentle, grounding gesture, resting lightly as though to remind me that I wasn't alone. The touch was brief, yet it sent a warmth through my chest, a quiet reassurance that lingered long after her fingers withdrew. I realized in that moment how much her presence mattered, how her steady, calm attentiveness could anchor me even in the middle of my own turmoil. There was a stillness between us, a pause that felt heavier than words. The sunlight caught in her hair, highlighting faint golden strands, and her eyes held a subtle intensity that made me want to stay there forever, just breathing in the quiet, shared intimacy of the moment. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed when I spoke honestly, the faint smile that tugged at the corners of her lips when she understood something I hadn't said aloud. For a long time, neither of us spoke, and yet the silence was filled with an unspoken acknowledgement, an awareness that something profound was unfolding. My hand shifted slightly on the desk, and our knees brushed lightly, an innocent yet charged contact that made my pulse quicken. It was a gesture that carried no words but spoke volumes, a confirmation that the connection between us had deepened in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. When the conversation ended, I felt lighter, yet more aware than ever of the quiet, magnetic pull between us. There was no rush, no overt declaration, just a mutual understanding, a soft promise that the connection we shared, built on honesty and gentle attention, was something rare and significant. The room, once ordinary, felt transformed, a private space of trust, care, and a slow-burning intimacy that neither of us needed to name aloud to recognize. The classroom was quiet once again, the late afternoon sun slipping toward the horizon, casting long, gentle shadows across the floor. The papers and books that had cluttered the desks were now neatly stacked, and the room had the calm, almost sacred feel of a place suspended in time. The air seemed warmer somehow, charged with the residual intimacy of moments shared and words spoken, and I realized how much I had been carrying this sense of connection with me over the past weeks. She looked up from her desk as I gathered my things, her eyes meeting mine with that familiar, subtle warmth that had become both comforting and thrilling. There was a softness in her gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of all the small gestures, conversations, and moments we had shared, the unspoken understanding that had grown between us. It wasn't forward, it wasn't bold, it was a smile that lingered just long enough to make my heart quicken, a smile that spoke of trust, affection, and gentle recognition. As I moved to leave, she handed me a small note, her fingers brushing mine ever so lightly in the exchange. The contact was fleeting but enough to send a spark through me, a reminder of the subtle, steady bond that had formed in the quiet classroom afternoons. I held the note carefully, sensing that the words on it carried more than their literal meaning, an invitation, a reassurance, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection we had nurtured. The sunlight caught in her hair one last time as I turned toward the door, highlighting the faint golden strands that had always seemed to glow in those quiet moments. I noticed the gentle tilt of her head, the calm, confident posture that radiated warmth without demanding attention. In that simple, ordinary moment, I realized how extraordinary she had become in my eyes, not because of any grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but because of the steady, thoughtful care she had shown, the way she had made me feel seen, valued, and understood. Walking through the empty hallway, the note secure in my hand, I felt a quiet joy, a sense of contentment that had been slowly building over days and weeks. There was no rush, no need to define or label what had passed between us. The emotional intimacy, the lingering touches, the shared silences, all of it had created a bond that was satisfying in its subtlety, tender in its restraint. I glanced back toward the classroom once, catching her silhouette framed by the fading sunlight. Her smile was still there, gentle and knowing, a quiet promise of more moments like these, of continued understanding and unspoken connection. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a sense of closure that wasn't the end but rather a beginning of something carefully nurtured, delicate yet resilient. The ordinary classroom had transformed into a space of quiet magic, and I left with the memory of soft glances, fleeting touches, and shared vulnerability imprinted on me. The story had reached its emotional peak, and the slow-burn romance had settled into a gentle, lasting warmth, a connection that would linger far longer than the day, far longer than the afternoon, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats and memories. If this story left your heart a little warmer, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another slow-burn romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment touched you the most.